come to another quite familiar story. Disciples getting in a boat and going across the Sea of Galilee and running into a storm. There's actually, the gospel narratives give us two specific times when this happened. Matthew chapter 8 and chapter 14 and Mark chapter 4 and chapter 6 tell us of two different times when the disciples got in a boat and crossed the Sea of Galilee, and both times they ran into storms. And so just a quick note of the differences of these two particular instances that this happened. First one is they actually went in opposite directions. The first time we read that they got in a boat and set off across the Sea of Galilee, they were going from Capernaum and they were headed east. This time they're on the east side after Jesus has fed the 5,000. And that night they got into a boat and they went the opposite direction. Now they're going towards Capernaum or basically east to northwest. In the first situation, Jesus started off with them in the boat. This, of course, if you were just paying attention to the story, Jesus wound up in the boat, but didn't start off in the boat. Third is, in the first story, Jesus was asleep in the boat and woke up and calmed the storm. And in this story, he walked upon the water, and when he stepped into the boat, the storm was calmed. Here's, to me, the most interesting thing between the two stories. The first story, the disciples' reaction. In the first time they crossed over and Jesus calmed the storm, their reaction, Matthew 8:27, they asked a question. What kind of man is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Now, this second experience, they in a sense answer their own question in their reaction, because they say, is recorded in Matthew 14:33, it says, those who were in the boat worshiped him and said, truly, you are the Son of God. So they answered their own question. Second time they experienced that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the whole subject of storms. And listen, I got saved when I was 19. I'm now 65. So what is that? 40 some years? 46, thank you. 46 years. My perspective has changed a whole lot. In my 46 years, I haven't gotten a lot of wisdom, but one thing I have become understanding of is that there's only two pathways in life that lead us directly into the pathway of storms. The first pathway we can choose in life that will lead us directly into storms is the choice of living in complete disobedience and disregard for God and his counsel and his word. That is a sure way to walk right into some life storms. The other pathway we can take that leads us directly into storms is complete obedience and faithfulness and serving the Lord. It doesn't leave us anything else. And it says basically what we all know, that just living life will bring you into storm. I know my perspective when I was young, I didn't understand this. My ideas, maybe the style of preaching and teaching I was exposed to, didn't allow that be part of how I perceived life. I always thought it was cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. That anything negative that happened in my life somehow was a causation of me making a bad choice. Now, the fact of it is that storms come in many forms, right? They can come in health crises, financial crises, relationship crises, all kinds of pain and loss and heartache and trouble. But the reality of it is that both the righteous and the unrighteous experience these storms. The godly and the ungodly. The most loving, humble, generous person and the most hateful, deceitful, selfish person will all encounter storms in their life. Now, because storms come in many different forms, of course, the characteristic of those storms can be different based upon how you choose to live your life. But there's also a whole category of storms that is no respecter of persons. That regardless of you living a godly life or an ungodly life, there are certain storms that may visit you regardless of your lifestyle. And I want to just read a portion of Psalm 107, because in this, it teaches us something of this. So Psalm 107 is a long psalm, and I'm only going to read a portion of it. But as I read this portion of Psalm 107, I want you to make a mental note of 4 different groups of people that this tells the story of. We begin in verse 4, Psalm 107. It says, "Some wandered in the desert and wastelands, finding no city where they could settle. They were hungry and they were thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds to mankind." Second category, verse 10. "Some sat in darkness and in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains, because they rebelled against God's commands and despised the plans of the Most High. So he subjected them to bitter labor, and they stumbled, and there was no help for them. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of their darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind." Third group of people. "Some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all manner of food and drew near to the gates of death. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress, and he sent out his word to heal them." Fourth category. "Some went out to the sea on ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and he stirred up a tempest, and it lifted up high its waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness, for his wonderful work to mankind." My point is, you had 4 categories of people. You had rebellious, and you had people just looking for a home, looking for a place to plant their roots and to raise a family and to have a life. You had some that were foolish and outright rebellious towards God. And then you had guys just going to work. They were just merchants. They were just earning an honest day's living. All 4 categories ran into great calamity, ran into great trouble, great significant storms, if you will. But the emphasis that I just wanted to bring out of that was the fact that you had 4 different categories of people. Some good, some bad. Some doing what they should be doing, going to work. Some just being bad. But they all, in their lives and in their circumstances, ran into really what could be considered a storm. They ran into trouble. So the question is, I think really, as we are gathered here this morning, is really, it's not whether you're going to experience a hardship. It's a question of how we will go through it. 2, who we'll go through it with. And 3 is what life will look like on the other side of it. A storm by nature, when we think of storms, it's by nature disturbance. It's by nature disruption. The wind is blowing, the water's churning, rain falling, maybe hail, snow. It's disrupting the atmosphere. It's a disruption of your life. Quite often in an unexpected way. Suddenly things are turning and getting stirred up, and it feels chaotic. A storm really is chaos happening in the atmosphere. And that's how it feels to us. And in that chaos, it has a way of exposing the limits of what we can actually control in our life. Most of us, when life is calm, we tend to think that we have more control over things than we actually really do. And it isn't until a storm comes along that kind of reveals how much little I really can control in my life. And it brings a great sense of uncertainty. And it can plague us with thoughts, fearful thoughts, insecure thoughts, and many questions. How severe is this storm going to be? You know, it's like when, I know we haven't had one for a while, but when you feel an earthquake, I know my first thought is, how bad is this one? You know, like, is it going to stop? Is it going to keep going? But how severe is this storm? When you enter a storm, one of the questions is, how bad is this? How severe is this? Second question is going to be, how long does this last? How long will this particular storm last? And third, what's the landscape of my life, my home, my marriage? What's the landscape going to look like after the storm has passed by? How different is my life going to look? How different is my relationship going to look? How different is my finances going to look? What's my home going to look like after we've gotten through this? So, as we've already stated, as a child of God, we're not immune from these kinds of storms, but we also are mindful of this because we've become children of God. John 1:12, as many as believed and received him have become children of God. That comes with it a great reality that we are now brought under the care of the Father. That means being under the Father's care, we're no longer on our own. What is chaos to us is not chaos to God. What feels so suddenly precarious, everything's at risk, is not true in the mind of God. God is aware of the storms coming into our life, and he has made us promises. Now, again, he hasn't promised us that we won't go through the storm, but he promised us, in other words, he hasn't promised us a stormless life, but he has promised us a few things. Psalm 121 verse 8, the Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forever. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forever. What a powerful, precious promise by God to his people. We have another promise in Isaiah 41 verse 10. God says to his people, do not fear, for I am with you. Don't be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. In other words, God doesn't promise you and I as his children that we won't encounter storms, but he does promise that Jesus will always be in your boat when you encounter those storms. Sometimes he'll come and he'll calm the storm. Sometimes he'll just calm you in the storm, but he will always be with you. He will always be standing with you. He's always watching over you in that storm. That's a really profound and important thing for us to not just acknowledge, yeah, I know that, but it's that thing that calls us to deeply get a hold of it when we need it the most. To have it so rehearsed in us that when we hit those storms, it's our default. God, I know you're with me. I don't understand. I don't know where this is leading. I don't know how long this storm's going to be. I don't know what the effects of the storm are going to be. But I know one thing, that you are with me and you will never leave me and you'll never forsake me. And you're in the boat with me, no matter how high the waves get. And I want to say something too, because I understand when we're talking about storms and when I'm talking about storms, that covers a lot of different stuff. That covers stuff that we could bring into our life because we've made really bad choices. It can include things that have nothing to do with our choices. Literally just living life in this fallen world. So I want to say this. I don't believe that God causes every storm. I do believe he allows every storm as a Christian. I believe he allows whatever will touch our life. It doesn't mean he's the author of it. I don't believe that God created disease to take you through that. I believe it's part of us living in a corrupted, fallen world as a result of sin. And in that, God will allow certain things to touch us. But here's the point. No, God doesn't cause every storm, but he does allow whatever comes into our life. It's under his sovereign control because we're under the Father's care. But also, he will use every storm that he allows to touch your life. A point of faith where we don't get hung up so much on the whys of these storms, but how God is going to accomplish something in my life as I'm going through this. And so I want to touch on three things of how God does use these things as they come into our life. And again, I acknowledge that this is covering a gambit of circumstances. And let me say this too. I'm not here to offer some kind of superficial spiritual band-aid on your pain, on the severity of things that you've walked through. I'm not trying to give you some pastoral platitude. I simply want to take this opportunity in this story to bring us to what Scripture says to us, in where we are to plant our hope and our faith and to draw from, I think, some things that God has said over and over and over throughout the testimony of Scripture, to take heart, not to minimize or downplay particular storms, because some storms are way more severe than others. The first thing is God will use the storm to deepen your dependency upon him. In verse 16, it says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. When they got into the boat, they set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. There's a sense in which we see, even in the story, that Jesus, he had just fed the 5,000. They just experienced this miracle of him multiplying the loaves and the fishes. It says, 15, it says the crowd saw this, realized the miracle that had taken place, and they got so excited. A revolution was in the air. They wanted to take Jesus by force and make him their king, not because they saw him as their savior, but because they wanted him to overthrow Rome. They thought, this is our guy. If he can do this, he's our guy. He's the guy that we want to hitch our wagon to. Well, as we continue on through the chapter, we're going to see that's going to be very disappointing for some of them. But they try to take Jesus by force, to force him to be their king. Jesus, aware of this, is not a political king. He didn't intend to be a political king. So he withdrew with his disciples. And when it got dark, he sent his disciples down to the shore to get on a boat and go across to Capernaum. And he went up on top of the mountain to spend time with his Father. Jesus intentionally sent off his disciples in a boat that he knew would be heading into a storm. The disciples weren't wandering around. They didn't get themselves into trouble. They literally were going at his command. In fact, Mark 6:45 says it this way: Jesus compelled them to get in the boat. Maybe there was a little bit of resistance. Maybe Jesus said, hey, I want you guys to get in the boat and go across the sea. Maybe some of them said, we're experienced fishermen, Lord, and we know that getting into the boat at night, going across the middle of Galilee is not a good idea. And what, you're not coming with us? But it says in Mark 6:45 that he insisted they get in that boat and cross over at night. These guys were skilled fishermen. Most of them were skilled fishermen. But even they were not ready to deal with this storm. There's only so many things you can control. And in a sense, as we already said, this storm has a way of stripping away what we think that we can control in our life. And this storm quickly brought these men who were skilled at being on that ocean. It brought them to a point where they were being stripped from their self-reliance. There was something bigger than any of their skills would allow them to handle. It exposes our limitations. That's what storms do. Suddenly you get a phone call. Suddenly something happens and you realize, man, I wasn't prepared for this. In a sense, when life is calm, we can rely upon our strength. We can rely upon our know-how, our skills, our wisdom, our experience, our friends' network, a lot of things. But suddenly that gets ripped out from underneath us. And we kind of, in a sense, feel like we're in free fall. And it challenges us, and it forces us in that moment to once again re-grip our dependency upon God, because it's bigger than us. It's over our heads. It's really where faith is refined, of course. And it's where faith is proven genuine, in the fire. Faith isn't proven genuine as much as when everything's going right. It's when everything is going wrong. It tests us. Think about Job. I don't think there's anybody in the scripture that went through greater storms in his life than Job did. And Job said in chapter 23, verse 10, he said, when the Lord has tested me, I will come forth as gold. The storms repeatedly in Job's life was testing his ability to trust that God was still in control, that God was still sovereign. Even though everything in his life, everything in his experience was shouting at him, either God doesn't exist or God's character isn't good, he's not for you. And he had a wealth of people around him just to affirm that, to just confirm those accusations. But it's in the sense of such deep trouble and such deep storms that we're being trained to trust him in the darkness and in the uncertainties until the sun comes up again. There's a season, there's a period of time where all we have is darkness, All we have is the unanswered questions. All we have are the issues, and we don't see the resolve. It's like we're being schooled. And part of that schooling is to train us as his sons and his daughters to call upon his name. Call upon the name of the Lord. Call upon the name of the Lord. Call upon the name of the Lord throughout the scriptures. Call upon his name. It's the endurance training of our faith. And it's navigating through the confusion and the chaos that feels like it's just all around us. Trust God in the dark until the light appears again. And in a sense, it's a great picture because these disciples were in the dark on the water. It's the moment of challenge of the circumstances that we can't see the other side of. Again, let me emphasize this. Sometimes our hardships that we face are not a result or consequence of how you've been living your life. Sometimes it's just simply being in a world that is corrupted, contaminated, and cursed by sin. Some of it just comes along with the world in which we live in. So again, the question is not so much why. The question is, what is the Lord going to produce in my heart of faith as I endure this, as I walk through this? What's my life going to look like after this storm passes? Who am I going to be when I get on the other side of this storm? Second thing, he leads us into storms so that he can display his power and his glory in a way that wouldn't be displayed if the storm wasn't there. Look at verse 18 and 19. It says, a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 to 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. As we get a picture of this, a couple of things, just the geographical factors of the Sea of Galilee lended themselves to be very susceptible to sudden and tremendous storms. One is, and those of you who've been to Israel know this, the Sea of Galilee sits in this pocket. It's in the Jordan Valley, and it sits about 700 feet below sea level. And in fact, it's one of the lowest, if not the lowest, freshwater bodies of water on Earth. You could say the Dead Sea, but that's salty. But anyways, it sits about 700 feet below sea level, and the mountains around it, the highest peak's up about 2,000 feet. And so what happens is that the cooler air comes from the Mediterranean, comes down the mountainsides, and meets the warm, humid air off the water. It mixes, and it creates like a funnel of wind. This was not like a weird occurrence. This was something that probably happened a number of times. It's probably one of the reasons why the disciples were a little cautious about going in the middle of the night. But anyways, and the fact that they were going towards Capernaum would have meant they were heading right into the winds. And we get that. It says they've been rowing for 3 to 4 hours. I'm sorry. They had gone 3 to 4 miles. It says in Matthew's gospel, it says this happened when they were in the 4th watch. So probably around 3, 4, 5 a.m. in the morning. If these guys left when it got dark, they had been rowing for about 6 hours maybe. Like this was a long battle, a long fight. And it says they were only a little more than halfway there. I mean, that does feel kind of like us when we're in a storm. We take 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But really, it was setting the stage for Jesus to reveal something of his glory and his power to these men who committed to following him. When they saw Jesus walking on the water, one of the accounts, I think it's Matthew, said they thought it was a ghost. Well, first of all, they weren't expecting Jesus. This wasn't like, hey, Jesus saying, hey, you guys go, I'll meet you on the water at some point. They were just trying to get to the other side, and almost in the middle of the night, they're battling this storm, and then they see this figure coming towards them, walking on the water. I mean, of course, they just thought it was like a spirit, a ghost. But isn't it interesting that Jesus chose in this moment of their own peril, and it was peril. From their point of view, this was a very dangerous and hazardous situation. In their view, everything kind of was on the table. Their own survival was on the table. Life felt very precarious for them. Their future was in the balance. Everything was in the balance. But that's the point where Jesus meets them. He chose to come to them in that moment. And I think that's significant, that he came in the middle of what threatened them the most. These waves, the storm, was threatening their life. And that is the very place that Jesus met these devoted men. And he revealed his divine power and his authority in the midst of this trouble. And not only in the midst of the trouble, but he revealed his authority and power over the trouble. He's walking on the very thing that they're afraid of. He's walking on the waves. He's walking on the very thing that they were terrified of. He walked in the midst of that. There's just a vivid picture of being in a storm and the emotional cost, the physical cost, the mental cost of what someone's experiencing when they're brought to their very limits of being able to handle it. But Jesus coming and meeting them in that moment. Isaiah 43 verse 2, God promises, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. He was coming to be with them. I do think this is true, that in a storm, he can show us his glory and his power and his provision in a way that we would not see or get otherwise. It's kind of like, it's not until the sky gets dark that we can see the stars. The stars are still there. They're right there, I mean, it's cloudy now, you can't see them. But if the sun was out, you just couldn't see them because there's no contrast. It's like in the contrast of the darkness, he can reveal something about himself that he wants you to get, that he wants you to know, that he wants you to continue to tie your faith to be certain about his character, to be certain about his promises, to become so accentuated in those moments where we're struggling. I love this quote. Elizabeth Elliot, she wrote a book called Keep a Quiet Heart. And in that book, she said this. She said, the secret is Christ in me, not me in a different circumstance. The secret is Christ in me, not me in a different circumstance. We're always like trying to get a change of circumstance. The answer is, I got to get in a different situation. But I thought this was very profound. In other words, it's God in me that will sustain me and provide for me in whatever circumstance I am. And the secret of my walk and the secret of my faith and the secret of my peace is going to come from the fact that he is in me before my circumstance changes. The answer isn't just move across town. The answer isn't, get rid of this person in your life. The answer isn't make more money or do whatever. The answer is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And in that is his provision, his peace, and most of all, his presence. I think the toughest part about storms, though, beyond the storm itself, whatever the circumstance is truly the sense that we've been abandoned, or a sense of we feel isolated. That's what pain does. Pain isolates us. Pain causes us to feel like we have been abandoned, even if our thoughts and our faith tells us otherwise. Our feelings tell us Jesus has left you alone. Jesus has kind of looked away for a second. That really is, I think, the hardest part of going through a difficult time. He's nowhere in sight. I pray, but I don't hear anything. I keep asking God to speak, but his voice is silent. What we don't understand in the moment, but eventually we will, is that he has not left us. He has not abandoned you. That he's been there the whole time. That is his promise. He's still in the boat with you. In your pain and in your struggle, part of the test is he's allowing you to experience a sense of that. And that's what these disciples experienced for hours. That Jesus wasn't with us. He's up on a hill someplace. And this is all in our hands right now. Our life is in our hands. Our ability to get through this is all on us right now. Meanwhile, it says in the Gospel of Mark's take on this, it says that while he was still on that mountain, that he saw them in the storm. The only way we can explain that is it's explaining Jesus' supernatural ability as the Son of God to see his disciples in the storm on the lake. And it goes back to what God's promised his people, that he watches over us, our comings and our goings, both now and forever. Third point is that the storms play a part in bringing us to our ultimate destination, predetermined destination. In verse 20 and 21, he says, and he said to them, it is I, don't be afraid. And then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. He meets them in the moment of this fear, this frustration they probably had. Jesus doesn't always come to calm the storm around us, but he does come to calm the storm inside of us. And here we see him use this phrase to his disciples, it is I, don't be afraid. It is the phrase in Greek that echoes the phrase in Hebrew, how God revealed himself even in Exodus when he said, I am, when he revealed himself to Moses, I am. This is the Greek version of this. Ego eimi, I am. He's echoing the divine signature of God himself when he says to them, I am, don't be afraid. I am. Just the same phrase he uses later on in this chapter when he says, I am the bread of life. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And remember when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he said, who are you looking for? And they said it. And Jesus says, I am. And they fell back on their backs. Same phrase, I am. It was a statement of his authority and his divinity when he said, I am to these men. Don't be afraid. That word, don't be afraid, phobeo, means don't take flight in fear. Don't be so terrified that you split. I'm here. I'm here. And it gives you a picture of Jesus coming and intervening in the life of these men in the midst of their fear, in the midst of circumstances that were overwhelming to them, in the midst, in a sense, of that which opposed them. Their enemy was the storm. Their enemy was that which was going to separate them from the promises of God and from even living their own life. And in a sense, God continues to show us that throughout the scripture. All he will step in and oppose what opposes us, that which wants to take away from us our inheritance. God steps in opposition. I mean, I was thinking about this, Psalm 36, the testimony of God's people in this psalm, speaking of when they got delivered out of Egypt. A couple of verses from there, it says, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, his love endures forever. To him who divided the Red Sea asunder, his love endures forever. Who brought Israel out of the midst of it, his love endures forever. To him who led his people through the wilderness, his love endures forever, and gave them their land as an inheritance. His love endures forever, and freed us from our enemies. His love endures forever. Who struck down great kings on our behalf. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of heaven, who love endures forever. The point is that the storm was not going to keep these men who'd chosen to follow Christ from their predestined destination. God had a purpose for their life. God had a destination for them to arrive to, and this was not going to keep them from it. In their minds, it was all up for grabs. It was all precarious. It was all possibly not going to happen. The fact is that in our life as Christians, the storms don't actually threaten the course that we're on with God. They're actually part of the course that we are on with God. It's a part of where God is taking us. He brings us to our destination, and he uses all that comes into our life as a part of that. From their viewpoint, the treacherousness, the danger, the hazard, the precariousness, but from God's viewpoint, it was never in question. It was never in question. There was never a millisecond where things maybe were not going to work out. Even when we are overcome with fear and doubt, it doesn't change God's faithfulness and his promises to you. The chaos, the uncertainty, even when we feel like we're completely abandoned, does not change the reality that Jesus is still in the boat with us, that his promises are faithful and true, that his mercies are new every morning. And when we grow anxious, often we feel then shame that we even feel anxious. We beat ourselves up. I should trust God more than I am. It's all part of God taking you through the storm. It's all a part of God navigating you through your life. And the destination he has in mind for you has not changed. Now, I don't simply mean the destination of glory. There's another destination. It's what God is working out in your life. There's a destination of the person that you will be when you take your last breath. There's a destination of after he has completed his good work in you, conforming you into the image of his son, that image that he has predetermined in your life and in my life, that destination is a secure destination. He will accomplish what he's going to work in you. And part of the storms and struggles is a part of his work in you. And every wave that breaks over your bow, every dark night, he has stood over you. He has watched over you. He has never abandoned you. And the day will come when we will see him and know him as we are known. And then we will see clearly all those storms we walked through, he was always by us. It's just on this side, it's obscured from us. It's hidden from us. God is the one who's navigating you. Even when you feel like, man, the boat's just being tossed. There's no control. He is still in perfect dominion over everything that touches your life. But in Acts 27, remember the story where Paul has been taken prisoner. God's promised him that he is going to stand before Caesar in Rome to stand trial. So they put him on a ship with a bunch of other prisoners. About halfway through that journey, they wind up on an island, the island of Crete. They set out from Crete on another boat, and the captain decides to sail west and then north up to Rome, and they hit a great storm. And during this storm, they begin to, even the seasoned sailors begin to lose heart. They start throwing even the tackle overboard. And it says they actually tie ropes from one side of the boat underneath the boat to the other to try and hold the wooden boat together in the storm. They have no food, water, because they've thrown everything overboard to stay afloat. And Paul stands up before the crew and he says this, I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost. The ship itself will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God came and spoke to me, and he assured me, Paul, do not be afraid. You will appear before Caesar. God has graciously given you the lives of all those who sail with you. So he says to these men, so keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he has told me. Well, 14 days later, they're still in the storm. They finally run aground on the island of Malta. But the end of the story is not one man is lost. The ship is destroyed, and Paul winds up going to Rome. God's faithfulness to Paul in the storm. The conclusion, of course, is that God doesn't cause every storm, but he allows every storm, and he will use every storm. God remains that fixed point of reference for us. His word, his promise to be that fixed point through the storm. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea hushed. Then they were glad when it became calm, and he guided them to their desired haven.